acknowledged its pre-war reporting had been deeply flawed. A Times editor called it an institutional problem, indicting editors and reporters who, quote, coddled sources and practiced hit-and-run journalism. He admitted that America's self-styled newspaper of record had not just reported the story but become part of it. Quote, covering the war was not the Times at its best.
Only now, of course, we're learning so much of the stuff that we simply assumed must be accurate. It wasn't accurate at all.
The ombudsman of the Washington Post later admitted, it's clear now that the press as a whole did not do a very good job in challenging administration claims.
Critical perspectives about alternatives to war, all the kind of efforts and discussion of the peace movement virtually disappeared from the media at that very point where notionally a society was making up its mind as to whether to go to war or not.
The media monitoring group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR, studied 1,617 on-camera sources between March 20th and April 9th, 2003. They found 71% of all sources were pro-war, only 3% anti-war.
I saw a figure the other day of something like, I forgot the exact figures, but something like there were 800 experts used during the war on all the American broadcast outlets, and only 6 were opposed to the war. Now, that seems a pretty odd state of affairs.
In this period, I was hoping war would be averted. UN deliberations were covered, but dismissively. International opinion was not taken seriously. The media frame became us versus them. There was a buzz here for many weeks. One journalist told me that buzz is gone. Instead, there's a pall, a feeling of total frustration. The United Nations wanted to give the arms inspectors time to finish the job, but the Bush administration bypassed the UN, claiming to act in its name by launching a preventive war, unilaterally, as an act of self-defense. Britain and a few other nations joined what was officially branded a coalition of the willing. Critics called it a coalition for the drilling. The United Nations survived this failure.
The United Nations is more important than ever. We need collective responsibility.
When countries like France called for more UN inspections, they were denounced as cheese-eating surrender monkeys in some media outlets.
And
despite the fact that we have no weapons of mass destruction, the US armies have crossed the Atlantic and they are preparing hundreds of thousands of other soldiers.
The United States insisted they were there. What happened to those weapons?
Well, I think it has been destroyed. It has been destroyed by the Iraqi government because they felt at that time that there is no need for it. Anyway, they cannot use it because if they would like to use these chemical weapons, the other side will destroy the whole Iraqi people, the whole Iraqi country. So I think they did realize that, and for this reason they destroyed it. And they destroyed it earlier, 91, 92.
This claim, ridiculed by the media then, is largely accepted now. An exhaustive March 2004 University of Maryland study on the coverage of WMDs found that threat was exaggerated, reported inaccurately, and irresponsibly. After the invasion phase of the war ended, journalists debated their role in fueling a war climate.
The run-up to the war was extremely well covered. The run-up to the war was one side.
Why? That's what we voted on.
Most of the...
On one panel, Harper's Rick MacArthur challenged Time Magazine's Michael Elliott. Afterwards, I spoke with both. Is it the news culture? Is it the lack of critical thinking? Is it economic interests?
Well,
is it all of the
It's all those things, but it's mostly owners who don't care about journalism.
I think the American media has done a fabulous job since September the 11th.
Wasn't this a media system that was cheerleading for the war?
I think undoubtedly what you saw in the war was a sharper distinction between the print media and the TV media than I've ever seen before. Or maybe I should have said that in the session just now.
They got to watch what they say. If Michael Elliott gets up there and says, yeah, Time didn't do a very good job covering the war or covering the run-up to the war. He's out of a job. He's going to get in trouble with his bosses. I can say it because I'm a publisher.
In the run-up to war, dissent was marginalized, debate was limited, protest and protesters seen but rarely heard.
More than 1 million demonstrators turned out in London. The march is thought to be the largest ever in Great Britain.
Sadly, the coverage was at its worst in the period when it mattered most. The period bracketed by the worldwide demonstrations on February the 15th and actually going to war was one in which British public opinion turned round from being approximately 60-40 against the war to approximately 60-40 in favour of the war.
Washington Post ombudsman Michael Gettler blasted his own paper for underreporting or poorly displaying coverage of big demonstrations here and abroad.
There was fairly decent coverage of the fact that there was an anti-war movement. What there was not decent coverage was the analysis of what we were trying to say about what was wrong with the war, why we never should have gone to war, why the war needed to end, what was driving the motor force behind the war. That analysis never got into the mainstream media.
It was freezing in New York during the huge February demonstration.
I think it's ironic it's taken George W. Bush to sort of revive the progressive movement in the United States and Western Europe. Hey!
How is it? Great to see you. And everybody looked at me like...
South Africa's Bishop Tutu was a featured speaker.
What do we say to peace?
The mainstream media sort of ghettoizes this kind of coverage and doesn't allow it to really enter into the mainstream discourse. I think they'll report it, they'll show the crowds as a mass, they might show some sound bites, but they won't really get into like what the significance of this movement is.
At later protests, I spoke with journalists and activists about the coverage we were then being bombarded with.
The purpose of journalism is to question the prevailing wisdom. The journalism we see in this country, for the most part in the mainstream media, does not question anything.
And that scares me to think that here it is, it's a war, people's lives, the whole world is changing, and most of us are just watching it like another entertainment channel.
If we invade Iraq, there's a United Nations estimate that says there will be up to 500,000 people killed or wounded. Do we have the right to do that to a country that's done nothing to us?
Frozen out of the news, activists tried to buy airtime for anti-war commercials like this.
No nation under God has that right. It violates international law. It violates God's law.
Most networks wouldn't run the spots, even for the money. Many activists soured on mainstream news, turning to hundreds of internet sites. They also turned to foreign TV outlets, especially the BBC.
Iraq, Saddam. Iraq, Saddam.
Many young people abandoned the news altogether, preferring satirical newspapers like The Onion and comedy news shows. Many turned to alternative and independent media.
It's up to the media to challenge those in power, not to cozy up to power. So you have this media that's embedded now in the government, in the military, and yet at the same time there's hope because there is a response to that, and that is the independent media movement.
A global news army was put in place before war erupted. On all sides of the conflict, media outlets were spun or controlled by governments. In Baghdad, mainstream journalists say it was tough to get the truth. Sometimes independent reporters were able to do better.
Every foreigner is followed by the secret police, but journalists are watched even closer. And there was an army under Saddam Hussein of government officials whose only job it was to spy on journalists. So you have no way to avoid being under the control of the Iraqi Ministry of Information.
They tapped my phone in my office, my hotel room. There was a small camera in my hotel which watched my every movement. I used to have to go into the loo to get changed.
I determined that the best thing was to not get accreditation as a journalist in my visa and to go in as a humanitarian worker.
They are not near Baghdad. Don't believe them. They are nowhere. This is silly.
Iraq's media minders worked for the Minister of Information, Mohammed al-Sahaf, known in the West as Comical Ali for his false claims. Most of his threats of Iraqi resolve were treated as a joke. Later, as resistance emerged, some now seem almost prophetic.
The bribery system was appalling. Some television crews were paying up to $5,000 per visa.
So in the case of Rupert Murdoch, he has a tremendous number of media outlets, probably the most of any single company or person in the world, operating in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And one colleague who works in a Murdoch news operation estimated that Rupert Murdoch was giving as much as $500,000 to Saddam Hussein's government during the lead up to the war, just for permission for his news outlets to operate there. And there was a running joke that Rupert Murdoch was the second greatest source of cash for Saddam Hussein, second only to oil smuggling.
There are pockets like Tikrit.
If Iraqis were corrupt, so were some Western media outlets. New York Times correspondent John Burns and others accused Western media companies of competing through corruption, literally buying access for their correspondents and cameras, while not covering human rights abuses and the suffering of the people. CNN later admitted it did not report abuses of its own staff members in order to keep its office open in Iraq.
F-18 streaked in.
Few of the journalists who covered the war covered the way it was really covered. Independent reporter Robert Young Pelton, author of this best-selling travel book to the world's most dangerous places, had his eye on the media eye.
There was never any sense that we might go to war. It was always like, we're going to attack Saddam Hussein, and here's why. There was very much a script on how this war was handled. There was a kickoff.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours.
And then there was a countdown. You got 48 hours to get out of town. Then it was like everybody tuned in for the opening kickoff. As the war progressed, it was done on a linear scale. We're going from here to there. It was almost like we're running a pass. There were people actually drawing diagrams, generals drawing diagrams on a map that looked just like a football play. You know, we're going to go sneak around here, we're going to do this, and we're coming up there, and we're doing that.
This sports metaphor offered a simplified narrative, mimicking a familiar TV format. When Pelton was delayed getting into Iraq, his focus became the press.
So I ended up being the only person embedded with journalists during the war in a fancy hotel in Jordan.
Right now there's apparently 4,000 journalists everywhere from Kuwait to Baghdad to Jordan to Syria to Turkey, all waiting for the war to start. And some of these people have been sitting around for 9 weeks.
They lived in very nice hotels. They were all on expense accounts. They met at the bar every night. They worked 24 hours a day.
The President will address the nation at 10:15.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Level of protection would be minimal, and if I were a news president or a news executive right now, I would be pulling my people out.
When the war had finally begun, the networks began pulling their reporters out of Baghdad. Peter Arnett was in the Iraqi capital with a National Geographic documentary team. He decided to stay.
Covering wars are a dangerous business. You can die, and those companies feel responsible for their people in harm's way. They sometimes order them out.
I think there is something to be said for staying. However, from a news executive standpoint, the risks are enormous.
I sort of have a genetic tick that allows me to go into dangerous areas without too much concern.
The interesting thing is that the American military